A well-known travel writer, he'll share stories of Bayfield and the Apostle Islands from his book, This Superior Place. Author Dennis McCann returns as my special guest next on I Remember. Hi, I'm Jim Peck. Welcome to I Remember. Joining me tonight is Dennis McCann. As an author and a former newspaper columnist, he's written about his travel adventures throughout Wisconsin and the Midwest. His latest book is about a place in the northern part of our state that he finds very special. Take a look.
The book is called This Superior Place, Stories of Bayfield and the Apostle Islands. For this adventure, author Dennis McCann takes us to the northern tip of Wisconsin. Located on Lake Superior, American Indians lived there long before any Europeans arrived. McCann explains how Madeline Island came to be named after an Ojibwe woman, and why the Ojibwe consider it their spiritual home. The scenic islands of this Great Lakes area are highlighted for their great geological importance as well as beauty. The stories in the book range from the historical to the modern day. The city of Bayfield was founded by Henry Maurer Rice in the 1850s. McCann notes that efforts to attract new settlers probably downplayed the severe winter season. With plentiful northern forest, a logging industry took hold during the lumber era. Another valuable resource was sandstone, and the quarries sent shipments of brownstone to cities around the country. And many, of course, chose fishing as a way to make their living. The area was very attractive to tourists in the past and most certainly is a destination today. The champion for a national park was Gaylord Nelson. Through his efforts, the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore was created in 1970, preserving 21 islands and 12 miles along the mainland for all.
I've got to read this because this is going to make everybody want to go up to where you live. Let the summer sun come and warm the blue water of Shawamakon Bay. Let the bright sun dance on the surface of the water while sailboats ride the breezes. And this is still the place that prompted the earliest recorded visitors to comment on its winsome ways. It is then and now a superior place. Wow.
I couldn't have said that better.
But I will tell you, Mr. McCann, in all my travels, no one has ever offered me a plate of whitefish livers.
You haven't lived then.
I guess not. Now, this is a specialty.
It's a specialty, more of an oddity in some ways for some people, but whitefish is a very popular fish from the lake. And years ago, one of the chefs came up with an idea, sort of a value-added approach by using the livers. And he fried or sauteed them with onions and peppers and a little bit of breading and served them. And a lot of people love them.
Are you one of them?
I do enjoy them.
Yeah.
My wife thinks of livers as a filtering organ and won't eat them.
Well, that's what they are. I mean,
yes.
All those years your mother told you to eat your liver, it's good for you, and then you find out it's the worst thing you can put in your body.
If they're prepared right, they're delicious.
Yep.
And many people love them.
They don't taste fishy? Or they taste
No,
like,
not if they're prepared the way I
like
described.
liver.
Yes.
Huh.
Chicken livers is what is the comparison.
I've never done. Are there still whitefish in those waters?
Absolutely. Whitefish is the biggest fish in the fishery up there.
Even now?
Yes. Whitefish and lake trout are the two biggest that people go after. Still a herring run as well in the fall, in November, but those are the two main fish.
Well, the herring run is phenomenal. I mean, that
used to be much bigger than it is even today. I just took a tour of a fish house and realized the other day how big it still is. And in November, there's a closed season for trout and whitefish. So they'd use that to go after the herring, which are the most, plentiful at that time. And they will bring in boats just filled with with herring, bring them in, pack and ship all over the world. They'll ship the roe to Europe for herring caviar, or herring roe as they call it. So it's still in demand.
Well, wasn't there, I think you write about this in your book, A Superior Place, that at one point, I think it was during the war, so many people were gone that they were hauling kids out of school.
That was at the peak of what they used to call the herring run, and they'd have boats going out and they would be so heavy coming in they'd be right down to the water level.
Wow.
And all the men were gone, so they would close school. All the women in town, all the kids from the high school would come and help pack the fish because it had to be packed and salted and shipped right away. And so it was very labor intensive and a very busy time, and they said it was after the fishing was done, then the aroma would last until Christmas. But another fisherman pointed out that it also paid for Christmas, so it was important.
Very good. So there was cash in the pocket at the end of this.
Absolutely.
Kids must have loved it.
You could make $1 a day pecking fish. So,
which was pretty good money back
in
then.
1944.
Especially if you're a kid.
That's right.
And you're getting out of school.
That's right.
When did fishing become a big thing up in that area as an industry?
As an industry, it started, Bayfield had a series of sort of booms and busts, and fishing sort of followed several other booms and took off probably in the late 1800s. A very large group of fishermen came over from two rivers and established their fishing camps on the islands, and they've been fishing there ever since. And it really peaked in the 1950s or so. Commercial fishing was just a huge industry. 70, 80 boats perhaps would go out every day.
Wow.
They would live out on the islands during the summer, establish fish camps, and boats would come and pick up the catch, but the fishermen would stay out there with their families. And then, of course, overproduction kind of took its toll. But the school teams are still called the trollers. Commercial fishing is still big, and there is still commercial fishing on a smaller and more regulated scale.
Who were those fishermen? You said they came from two rivers, but I assume they came from somewhere else first.
Well, a lot of the original ones were French-Canadian, and of course the Ojibwe fished before all of that. And then in the 1800s, the late 1800s, they started to come from Scandinavia, especially from Norway. And it was typical of immigration in the United States. They came to a place that looked like the place they had left, and if they came from coastal Norway, they came to Bayfield and it looked like home, and they found fishing that looked familiar as well.
But how'd they get to Bayfield? I mean, I figure they came to New York.
Yes.
And then how did they hear about Bayfield out in the middle of the country?
There's one old fisherman told a joke about how when they got to New York, they'd say they were from Norway and fished, and they'd say, and they'd pin a Booth Fisheries tag on their back, fill their pipe with snuff, and send them off to Bayfield. More likely it's because of family connections, that they knew others had gone to Bayfield and came the same way.
And whitefish was the first big commercial.
Yes, whitefish has always been a popular, but there's other species as well, but whitefish, herring, and lake trout are the big three in terms of commercial.
And as we just touched on, the whitefish got pretty well overfished, and they went to trout, right?
Yes. Well, and trout also got decimated. The predator, the sea lamprey, and overfishing. So for a long time, the commercial fishing just really nosedived, and that's when Bayfield took a population dip. A lot of people moved away. And so there is still fishing, and it's still an important part of the heritage, but it's not at the scale it used to be.
I didn't realize until I read your book how old, geologically old, this part of the country was.
Yeah, geology is not my strong suit, so I had to crib heavily on that from people who know it better. But, you know, if you've never been to the Apostle Islands and have seen those cliffs that have been worked on, you know, for ages, you know, hundreds of thousands of years or more by water, it's done a marvelous job of creating these sandstone bluffs and these magnificent caves that people love to go into, summer or winter. And so that's what makes it so popular with visitors who can go out and take a 3-hour boat ride around the islands and see them all and not have to even paddle a canoe to get to them.
But you can paddle a canoe or a kayak.
You have to be very careful. It's very dangerous.
Really?
What happens is the people will head out on calm water and Lake Superior will get in one of its moods.
Ooh.
And they typically advise first-timers to go with a guide who will help them. Even so, every other year or so that somebody gets lost, and that's always a tragedy when that happens.
That's a very, very dangerous lake, and we've talked about the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald and all sorts of ships that went down there.
Right. I volunteer at the Bayfield Maritime Museum, which is a wonderful place. And people do come in and they enjoy the shipwreck stories. And there are many of them because, you know, the lake is just, one of the old fishermen coined the phrase, the lake is the boss.
I love that.
And it's a popular T-shirt with visitors. And I've got one because it's really true that you can make all sorts of plans and head out, but the lake can change in a real hurry. The wind can change. Anything can happen. And if you don't know what you're doing out there, you know, we sit and watch sailboats out there sometimes where conditions change in a hurry. And you have to know what you're doing to get back in and safely.
It's a huge, first of all, Lake Superior is an enormous body of water.
It is. And where we are at the end of the lake, sheltered by the islands, is a little bit more protected than the open water. But from our house, we can always tell when it's really bad on the other side of Madeline Island because some of the big 1,000-footers will come in behind the island for the protection it affords. And so you can see if there's really a big storm out on the lake, you can look for one of the big lakers to come in.
And they'll sneak over so they're covered from the wind a little bit.
Right. Some of them will sit for a day or two and wait out storms.
You mentioned shipwrecks. There are a couple of famous shipwrecks. I'm thinking of the ship Lucerne.
The Lucerne, right. It's one of the more famous just because of the different accounts of how the storm came in on them. Everybody's familiar with the Edmund Fitzgerald. It's one of many, many shipwrecks. The Lucerne is interesting because in an effort to save themselves, the crew climbed the mast, several members of the crew, and tied themselves to the top of the mast. And when the shipwreck was found, they were still encased in ice in the top of the mast.
Ooh.
So it obviously did not work.
And the other one is the Savona?
The Savona, right. And I think, was it 6 or 7 men lost their lives in that one? There was a rescue attempt, and it all adds to the lighthouse lore up there because the people go out and try and save anybody they can when these shipwrecks took place. Now, these would be in the 1800s, not recently, obviously, but...
And there are stories about they could take this many, but they couldn't take the others, and people just don't leave us.
Right, right, and hollering, yeah, right, exactly. Entire books have been written about some of those shipwrecks, and every fall during the Lighthouse Festival, people go out and get some of those stories told again. There's certain fascination with all of that stuff that, other people's tragedies are interesting 100 years later.
Of course, yeah. And there's something about a shipwreck that even, it may have lumber, may have Christmas trees, one of the famous...
in Lake Michigan, right.
But we always think of buried treasure, and even though that doesn't exist, there's something very romantic about a shipwreck. Right.
Although sometimes when I sit late in the year and look out at that lake and it's really throwing a tantrum, and you think, why would people even challenge it?
Mm-hmm.
But they were making a living. Fishermen had to go out in that weather too.
Now there must have been a time, it just occurred to me, that there were no lighthouses, and then somebody decided to build a lighthouse. When did the lighthouses start hitting?
Oh boy, I told you not to ask me dates.
Well, roughly.
See, in the early 1800s, when they started. And of course they were cruder lighthouses at the time, and then they improved. The Apostle Islands eventually, I forget the final number, but right now there are still 6 that people can go and visit.
They're not working.
Some of them are still working.
Oh, they are?
Sure, they're still shipping up there.
Wow.
But they're all automated. There's no lighthouse keepers or anything like that. And more often the lights now would just be on a light station, not necessarily the old Fresnel lens up in the tower. But
what was life like for a what's the word? A lighthouse keeper?
For a keeper?
Yes.
Lonely, first of all. You're on an island. Your wife might not like to be there. Mm-hmm. You might have a feud with the assistant keeper, as I wrote about in one of the cases.
Yes,
here,
very.
Where they didn't get along, but
nasty.
they're living in the same house on the same island,
mm-hmm.
and finally one had to leave that. It was as lonely and hard a life as you'd expect. But the thing that I'm always impressed with in these stories is that most of those lives were hard. One of the points I make at the Maritime Museum when people come in is, they look out at all these fancy marinas now with sailboats and speedboats. And you try to show them in the museum how tough it used to be when the water was more of a workplace. Mm-hmm. You had to go out in those fishing boats. You had people living out on the islands making a living. They had to log those islands and bring all the lumber in.
Were the Apostle Islands logged?
Absolutely.
Because they seem so pristine.
That's what fools a lot of people.
Yeah.
When you go up there now, they declare the Gaylord Nelson wilderness over 90% of it, but that's not original in most cases. The first time that the National Park Service came up to look at the area to see if it was suitable for a national park, the inspector looked at it and said, "No, you're not ready," because they'd been logged off.
Oh.
Once the mainland had been logged off, they looked out and they saw there's still a whole lot of good hardwood and pine out on these islands.
After that, yeah.
And you can do it easily with a boat. It's not like in the woods where you have to run them down rivers in the spring. Here you could just load them onto boats the island. So they were easily transported. As late as the 1950s, the Lullaby Furniture Company from Stevens Point was still logging on some of the islands. I think Outer was their main one. And they making baby furniture out of wood from the Apostle Islands. So, as I mentioned in the book, there were people who probably grew up in an Apostle Islands crib before they ever came to the Apostle Islands.
What kind of wood were they shipping?
Initially, it was white pine, which was always the case in northern Wisconsin, because the Plains states needed white pine to build houses. It was as simple as that. And then hemlocks were valued for the tanneries. So the tanneries in Milwaukee needed hemlocks all the time. That became valuable. Then the hardwoods had all sorts of uses as well. Railroad ties. You need millions of railroad ties to reach the West Coast. And so they had to go to states that had lumber, and not all of them did. If you were going across Kansas, you couldn't find your own.
You were in big trouble looking for wood, yeah.
Right. So there were lots of uses for the wood.
How did the Apostle Islands get their name?
The most common explanation is that the French like to name things after religious images, and they would name there's not 12 islands, there are 22 islands, 21 in the national park.
Well, there are 14 teams in the Big Ten.
That's the point I make, yes.
Yes.
We're not going to laugh at their math, but that's the most common explanation. The individual islands have worn different names through the years. Some have changed and some have just lasted. Some of the old timers still will use the old names of certain islands just because it's just out of habit. There was once an effort to, instead of naming them the Apostle Islands, they wanted to call them the Federated Islands, and each one would be named after a state. So I think Madeline would have been Virginia Island, but that didn't take hold. There's still a Michigan Island, but for the most part, there's a whole varied list of names.
Didn't one of the islands try to change its name? Was it Cornucopia that wanted to be called something else?
That's a community on the mainland. Cornucopia is just up the road from Bayfield.
All right.
Wonderful little fishing community. If you're named after the Horn of Plenty, that's just a beautiful thing. But somebody proposed that they change the name of the town to North Pole, and that wasn't allowed by the post office. And I'm glad it wasn't, because Cornucopia is just a wonderful name for a community.
Whereas I think there's a North Pole somewhere else.
I'm sure there is,
Yeah.
yes.
But yeah, I like Cornucopia.
Cornucopia's their claim to fame is they have the northernmost post office in Wisconsin.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's a small claim, but it's...
Yeah, but it's nonetheless...
You work with what geography gave you, so...
Yes. Who was Hermit Wilson?
Hermit Wilson was a man who tried to make a name for himself on Madeline Island, and he lost a fight, and he declared that he wouldn't live on the island where he'd been bested, so he went to another island, and he was known as a hermit. It's Hermit Island, and Hermit grew some vegetables and would come to town occasionally. A lot of legends about him, probably none of them true, but there was some thought that he had buried a fortune, and people have periodically gone to look for it, but there's nothing.
I think that legend extends to virtually every town in America.
Absolutely.
There's always somebody that buried a fortune.
And there's always a tavern where Al Capone sat in a bar stool. But
yes, or George Washington slept.
Right.
Madeline Island has an interesting history.
Well, Madeline was the center of the fur trade early on in the 1600s. The Chippewa had made their home there, the Ojibwe people who came from the east. And it was a very special place to them, the island of the red-breasted woodpecker. And then along came the French Canadians, and the fur trade was headquartered there. John Jacob Astor's Fur Company had its headquarters there, which made sense because it was the large island accessible to everybody who's coming to trade. You could go there by canoe, and so they had trading posts. And one of the French traders married an Indian woman, the daughter of Chief White Crane, and so her American name, her religiously, when she was baptized, her name was changed to Madeline, and so they named the island after her. It's a wonderful little love story.
It is.
Yes.
And Bayfield is such a beautiful name. I mean, you think of the bay, and
Yes.
Is that why it was named that?
Not at all.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that would make sense because we have this beautiful bay and then a lot of agriculture up there that surprises people. But it was actually named after Henry Bayfield, who was the first British naval person to come and survey that part of the lake.
It's not even named after an American.
And he wasn't, he never actually saw the town that was named after him.
Seriously?
It was named for him by his friend Henry Rice, who wrote him a letter, and then he later wrote back and thanked him for the great honor and said, I never imagined when I camped there that this had ever happened. But he lent his name, and it's a wonderful name for a little town.
It is a wonderful name. You mentioned agriculture, and you're right. I was very surprised to find out that there was a lot of agriculture. Somehow I just don't put that together with a bunch of islands.
Well, again, you credit the lake for that because the lake takes a long time to warm during the summer. But when it gets warm in the summer, it stays warm through the fall, and it prevents an early frost. So they have this little microclimate up on the top of the bluffs overlooking the lake. There's probably 10 or 12 orchards up there right now. And right now, we're in berry season. It starts in July, strawberries come on, and usually by the 4th of July, you've got fresh Bayfield strawberries. Raspberries follow that, blackberries, cherries, blueberries have a nice long August into September.
And then blackberry.
And that, well, blackberry are there all the time. Yes.
They are. Yeah.
Yes. We had one in the yard 2 days ago.
Seriously?
Yeah, they just pass through. But,
Well, I wouldn't bother them.
but the big thing in the orchards is apples, and of course Bayfield is known for Apple Festival.
And is it? Oh, there's this. You got a great picture in the book of cows on Main Street.
Yes. I don't exactly know the reason for this, unless it was just the laziness of early homeowners, but cows always would roam the downtown streets, and they pretty much had the right of way just because they were large cows.
Well, yeah,
But they would bother people downtown on the streets. They would just sit down on the sidewalk, and the women would have to step over with their skirts. And
among their leavings.
yes, right. So there were a lot of issues with cows. One of the more famous stories is there was a wooden bridge that connected two neighborhoods over a very deep ravine. And Mrs. Jelinek, as she was named, led her herd of cows over this wooden bridge, and they were no sooner off than the bridge collapsed.
Ooh.
And it was an important bridge connecting these two neighborhoods, Swede Hill and Catholic Hill, as they called it, the areas. And so it took a long time, but they finally built a permanent iron bridge that still stands today, and it's only used now for pedestrian traffic. It's
No
not,
cows.
Well, as a matter of fact,
Really?
there's a fundraiser later this month for the Bayfield Historical Society, BHA. And as part of that, they're going to serve tea and drinks up on the iron bridge. And the story is that there will be cows in attendance to make it historically correct.
Yes, and I hope they're well behaved.
I think so.
Is it easy to get around in that part of the state?
Yes. It wasn't in the beginning. Bayfield was founded in 1856. And it was pretty much the end of the known world at that time in terms of Wisconsin, because it's right up on the very edge. There were no roads, and you could only reach it by water because there wasn't be railroad for 27 or 28 years. So when you can only get there by water, and only when the water is open from ice, it limited growth in a big way for quite a while. But it didn't stop the early founders from having this dream that Bayfield would be a city to rival Chicago or Superior, because it had this great natural harbor, and they had wonderful dreams when they began it in 1856.
Those are some dreams.
Big dreams. And then, of course, came the Panic of 1857, so 1 year later they were scratching for something to fill up their little town.
But it is a great harbor, isn't it?
It is a really nice harbor, and it's extremely popular today with sailors, recreational sailors. There are probably a dozen marinas from Cornucopia down through Ashland, and thousands of sailboats, power boats, and also kayakers.
Well, you do a huge regatta up there, a race.
Bayfield Race Week is big
That's-
race week, right? Is a big thing in July, and it's a Minneapolis-based sailing club that started it, because many of the sailors who come up are from the Twin Cities. That's
it's
the
closer.
largest. It's the largest feeder of tourists and visitors, and so they have a week of sailing on the lake around the islands. Very colorful. They'll get 25 boats out there with their spinnakers, and they go right by the house, and you can hear the sails snap, and you're supposed to call them sheets, not sails. You can tell I don't sail, but it's very fun to watch, and having that life in town at night is also good too.
Yeah, and it actually goes for a full. What is the? I'm going to use the wrong term, but there's something about a circuit, a special.
The Bayfield Triangle. There's 3 bars downtown that are popular with the sailors, and some of them do get lost in the Bayfield Triangle.
I see. What attracted you to it, by the way, Dennis? Well, you've been around the Midwest for so long.
Yeah, I actually dedicate the book to my wife and to our friend Judy, who more than 30 years ago told us about this place, and we had never been there. And she was going up there for a week on Madeline Island and said, "Why don't you come up?" And we drove all the way up, not really understanding what we were doing up there, and rented a little place in Bayfield and caught the ferry to Madeline Island and met her on the pier of the place she was staying, a chateau on Madeline Island.
Ooh.
And we ordered a glass of wine and watched the sunset over the mainland.
That was it.
And we said, "Where has this been all our lives?"
Yes.
And so we started going up. Madeline Island has one of the great 4th of Julys anywhere in the country. Really little hometown affair that has become hugely popular. And so I went up the next year to write about that. And I've only missed one parade in more than 30 years on the island. That's just where we are every 4th of July.
Now, do you stay year-round?
We don't. We still have a place in Madison for winter. That's our version of going south.
You go south. Yeah, right. Why not stay all year-round?
I still have family in the southern part of the state. And so until, at some point that may happen, but for now we divide.
Is there used to be an ice road. Does that still exist?
The ice road is between Bayfield and Madeline Island, or the Islanders will tell you it's between Madeline Island and Bayfield, because they are more eager to use the ice road and get off of the island at will. For people who haven't been there, what happens is the ferry keeps running until the ice gets to be about 8 or 10 inches thick, too thick for the ferry to keep going. It can't bust the ice anymore. Then they will use a wind sled that scoots across the top.
I've seen pictures of that.
It's like in the Everglades, if you can picture those kind of boats. Well, this goes across the top of the ice, and when it's not safe to drive a car, they can run the wind sled, because they have to get the island kids to school in Bayfield. Construction workers, people who live on the island need appointments.
Get to a doctor, get to a grocery store, get to a restaurant.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
Get to one of those bars.
Exactly. Well, the Madeline Island has a bar as well.
I see. Good.
Yeah, they're covered. But and then if it's deemed safe enough and it's inspected closely, Highway 13 extends to Madeline Island for as long as it's safe. This year it opened, and then it closed again, and then it opened again for a while. There have been 2 years in the last 10 or so where the ferry never quit running. So
Really?
you can talk about climate change, but there's studies up there that show winter is not as excessive as it used to be, not as harsh as it used to be. And if the ferry can run all year and we're playing golf at the end of March in Bayfield, you know that it was an easy winter.
That's not too
That didn't happen this year.
No, that's not too terrible, though.
We still had, we got a foot of snow on May 2nd this year.
What is the, roughly, again, not trying to pin you down to a specific number, but roughly population of the summer as opposed to population in the winter?
The official population of Bayfield is 470 people or something like that. Now, a lot of those people will spend the summer and go, and then there's the town of Bayfield and the town of Russell, which includes the Red Cliff Reservation. So I kid about it, but our metro population is about 2,500. Madeline Island might have 200 or 300 who stay year-round, and then in the summer it's a whole different ballgame. Because as I mentioned, the boats, and there are thousands of people who come up and stay on their boats, so they don't need a condo or an apartment or anything like that. So it really booms from July 1st through Labor Day, and then fall weekends are very busy. And it's getting to be more popular in winter as well.
I could understand that. The book is wonderful. I'll tell you, folks, this is going to make you want to move. It's called This Superior Place, Stories of Bayfield and the Apostle Islands by Dennis McCann. And as always, it's such a treat to see you.
It's good to be back.
When you come off your beautiful island and we get a chance to talk to you. Dennis, thanks very much for being with us. Thank you for being with us. I hope you'll join us next time as we continue to remember. Thank you.
Thank you.